Alright everyone, it's time for the porn ban proposal and my reaction to it, partially on Twitter last night. It's quite interesting. It's totally organic, by the way. It's not coordinated. It hasn't been organized at any central focal point. It's totally organic. We'll just leave it at that. Anyway, here's my thoughts. Number one, and Razorfist put it best last night, which is, if you're talking about a cultural movement, and I've mentioned this to Gab, I think, last month, if you wish to create a cultural movement among conservatives or among a whole population, it doesn't really matter, against the concept of pornography, under the auspices that it's bad for you or it's negative, it causes exploitation or something, which is kind of funny to hear some of these people say because they are MGTOW or support repealing women's suffrage, but okay, there's a little bit of oddity that goes on here. That's fine. It's not illegal, it's not unconstitutional, it's a social movement, and there are many of them. When you get to the point where you are proposing any form of legal ban on pornography depicting consenting adults, regardless of any ethical considerations, for the government, for the purposes of the law, it is both unconstitutional and inevitably and effectively immoral to do so. I'll explain why. This is going to be a slightly long video because there are so many thoughts to get across. The first part is that it would devolve into a situation that's like the drug war. The drug war is prefaced on the exact same excuse. Drugs bad, addiction bad, people dying. We'll ban it in order to prevent people from being exploited. What effectively happened with the drug war isn't that drugs went away. If anything, they became more prevalent. What ended up happening is that people who got addicted couldn't seek treatment without the risk of jail. And the production was handled by cartels. This is the same story as prohibition. Alcohol is prohibited long, long ago. A century ago, people got the bright idea that they could get rid of alcohol if they banned it and started putting people in jail for being drunks. What happened is that alcoholism rates skyrocketed, and it got pushed by the mafia. The mafia begins to flourish around this time because it just starts making booze. Instead of having quality controls because it was legal but regulated, instead of having a situation where crime was preempted from being involved because legal above-board brick-and-mortar businesses that don't have to pay to assassinate people all the time were the ones making the booze, the mafia did. The government got co-opted with it. Carpetbagging era aside, what typically happens is that when you have something illicit, it seeps into your government. So cocaine, in part, runs the CIA. There are people in Congress that are bought and paid for, in part by cartels, through slush money funds that usually are Qatari in origin, actually, at this point. We know this to be the case. It's been uncovered multiple times. You have that. You have, certainly, underground pornographic material that's been declared illicit. Now, if you declare a small subsection of something illicit, you are probably able to allocate the resources to suppress it. For instance, child exploitation, human slavery in Libya. To an extent, we're able to prevent that. Unfortunately, not as much as we would like to. I would point out that you're talking about giving the same government power that overthrew Gaddafi's government and led to that problem, but we'll just leave that aside for the moment as well. It takes a lot of credulity to believe that the U.S. government that can't effectively administer any other morally based banning would be able to administer a porn ban. There are other problems, and they all boil down to pragmatism. I'm not going to get so much into the morality side of things because for the purposes of the law, which is what actually pertains to my opinions here, it doesn't matter. Things can be right or wrong. So be it. The government is not a good arbiter or determinant of what that is. I would say this. Let us speculate a situation in which the U.S. bans pornography across the board, or it doesn't really matter. Let's say that it's 100% effective. Within the United States, no website is able to distribute it. Magazines are censored. You bring back like the McCarthy era or something. Okay, I'm sure some people would think that was a good time. Does this prevent a person from gaining a VPN and using a foreign site? No. If it's regulated, like let's say that you boil it down to, well, we just don't want children accessing porn. Okay, how are you going to do that? Clearly, clicking through I'm 18 or older doesn't really work, any more than for alcohol sites. I'm over 21, trust me, I can order tequila online. Doesn't really work. So then you need an ID system, you need internet identification. The problem is this, you're essentially talking about destroying web anonymity. This is why I'm questioning whether this is entirely organic or whether it was actually dreamed up by people whose end goal is that. I tend to distrust government. I tend to assume the worst when these things happen, because if the worst can happen, typically it seems to be. Maybe it's why Alex Jones is right so often. As far as porn being weaponized against the Western world or civilization or the non-Abrahamists, yeah, okay, if you believe that, start a social movement, it'll be more effective anyway. Because the government banning it's not going to do jack shit. It'll still be available, it'll just require one extra step, and it'll become illicit, therefore it will become more valuable. It'll become subcultural, which will tend to spread it further, trust me. Same way as censored music, banned radio shows, TV that's banned. Look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had capabilities of policing well beyond anything we currently have in the United States, even with Silicon Valley's advancements. And yet even they couldn't stop people from taking bootleg cassettes and handwritten books and spreading them around. I would say it's doomed. It's basically a DOA proposal unless it's a social movement. If you're talking, however, about a social movement, let me tell you what you'll actually get. You'll get a bunch of people who look at porn claiming that porn needs to be banned. And this is for the same reasons as other moralistic movements. We know about Ted Haggart. Ted Haggart was a famous evangelocon back in the day, 80s era. His two big things were don't do drugs and don't be gay. Because they're evil, they're sinful. They found him with an 18-year-old male hooker smoking meth. This happens more often than you'd like to suspect. Because the thing is, like moths to a flame, moral movements like that require authoritarianism inevitably are going to draw in charlatans that don't even coincide with the movement. Go to war, but I'm not fighting. Pay taxes, but I'm not paying them. The rich need to pay more, but not my group of rich people. You think of it time and time again. Gun control for thee, but not for me. Kamala Harris with her armed guards, or somebody like that saying that guns are evil and kill kids. It's hypocrisy. It's opportunism, and the problem is this. Moral movements that are authoritarian in form inevitably draw that because there's money to be made. Of course there is. More taxes, more money. More laws, more money. More regulations, more money. Even if they're not at the legal level and it's just a social movement, this can happen. Now, do I believe that some of these proponents, like the Golden One or Torba or something, do I believe that they're in bad faith? No. I believe that they believe what they're actually stressing, which is good because a lot of people go around and they don't. But they're clearly not going to be successful because there's no effective way to ban pornography anyway. Then we'll get to the technological argument briefly. Some people are like, well, it's not a matter of porn, it's a matter of the accessibility. The internet facilitates that. I don't dispute that. It is clearly more accessible to go on a computer and type a few words than it is to, 50 years ago, grab your dad's porno mags or something. That doesn't fundamentally matter because that's exactly the same argument that's made by the far left with regards to guns or hate speech. It's exactly the same, and by the way, if you were to successfully make arguments on banning porn of this kind in a court case, you would in effect champion hate speech legislation. That's a big fucking problem. That's because Miller was literally being invoked by some of these people. Literally what that would pertain to is cultural convention. Well, by and large, the things that you're saying, if you're a Banporn, no Cooming, no Nut November sort of person, your political views are probably well outside of the Overton window. To some degree. You may think them normal, I may not have a problem with them, but some random liberal on the street, some Bernie Sanders voter, they have a problem with you. They think you're a Nazi. The problem is that they speak for a left-wing convention that is closer to the center of that Overton window, at least in certain cultural aspects. You would empower them to ban hate speech because you would be applying the concept that it would have to have, in order for the porn to be legal, it would have to have artistic reasons, or it would have to be considered not obscene or something like that. There's a reason why these obscenity laws aren't enforced. I'll get into that as well briefly also. If you applied the same thing to hate speech, they're saying that that's not a form of speech. Well, it's not actually communicating anything, it's just a bunch of hateful mumbo-jumbo. They're making the same argument. This would be like if the Second Amendment protected guns, but it didn't protect magazines, or bullets, or a scope, or training with weapons, or actually utilizing them. It's just an object. Oh, you can have a gun, but you can't make them, you can't sell them, you can't transfer them, you can't supply them with ammunition. That's not the reason for the Second Amendment. I would briefly say as well, the spirit, again, don't focus on the amendment, don't focus on the wording, focus on the reason it exists. The reason for the First Amendment is explicitly to protect that which is considered obscene, taboo, evil, and objectively wrong. Nothing else needs to be protected. The British government, that their founders suffered under when they penned the Constitution thereafter, they were used to the British government censoring works under the concept that it was obscene or treasonous. They were used to that. They would never have supported the concept of banning pornography. Just like they would think that it was great if people rode around in tanks drunk all day. They would find that funny. Now, of course, we live in a society, so we temper things. We try to use common sense. It's not common sense to try to ban the unbannable and be just like the drug war. What I would say then as well, with regards to technology, if you were to effect a porn ban, let's say that it was declared constitutional, so all other things aside, the fact that obscenity laws aren't enforced because they've been repeatedly ruled to be unenforceable, generally speaking, public square applies, the Miller involved mailers actually, it didn't just involve a website. Aside from that, what if some other country starts hosting the content? What would you do? Because again, in order to block U.S. citizens from that content, if we're talking about the U.S. banning porn, in order to actually affect that, what you would have to do is block other countries' access to the internet at large. You'd have to use the internet like a cudgel. Internet firms would lose a hell of a lot of money, and the problem is that porn is pretty popular. If you look around the world, a large proportion of the world's population, even in the most moralistic of parts of the world, someplace like Pakistan or something, absorb porn in some methodology, and it was existent before the internet anyway. The fact that it's facilitated in moving from person to person almost doesn't matter, but there is one way in which I guess that's not the case, and that's peer-to-peer in similar services. The amount of porn that's already been made is massive. This whole block would have to be filled top to bottom with servers in order to store a small proportion of all the pornography that's in the world, if you count the stuff that isn't out there publicly and is just on a CD or whatever somewhere. The idea that it would be actually able to be prosecuted for a person to possess material that was already downloaded 10 years ago off of LimeWire or whatever, that's not going to work. It simply won't work. It's unenforceable. And unenforceable laws, they're protested against, they're actively resisted, and they're passively resisted against. It becomes unenforceable because there's no will to enforce it. The fact that a large proportion of people would worry about the exploitation of women, good, then that's something that you can tackle. But don't be a hypocrite and sit there on an Apple device, of all things, and whine about women's exploitation in porn when you're using a device that was made by 10-year-old child slaves in China that work in a factory with suicide nets. The other element that I just can't stand is the fucking hypocrisy from some people whose lives inevitably exploit minors and women and men and everything else in the world, the environment and fucking animals too, sitting there whining about the exploitation of one thing. And the reason why is because they consider the behavior itself to be degenerated. They don't give a fuck about exploitation of porn workers. If you talk to them in private conversation, oh, this prostitute this horrible wench this, it's a bunch of womanizing, basically. It's interesting to see people who were literal pickup artists in the past claiming that they care about women's rights. It's a very interesting thing indeed. There's no grifting going on here. It's all genuine and organic, guys. But I would say fundamentally, my opinion on this is the same as for many other things. I've been consistent on these things for now over a decade. Expanding state power won't work and is a dumb idea. Because what the state does is when you give it an inch, it takes 10 feet. It is inevitable. If you allow the state to construe any legalese to expand its power, it will inevitably do so because there is an impetus, a fiscal impetus to do so. Some bureau or some senator or a governor or whatever will find a way to misuse any law pen. What I think is that it would be much better if people would rely upon communities. If people had a sense of togetherness, of family, you wouldn't have so much exploitation. You wouldn't need a lot of laws because you'd have less crime. People would respect one another. If somebody was down and out, they'd be helped. If somebody wasn't, they wouldn't go around burglarizing because generally speaking, things would be more cohesive culturally. This is the way forward. If you want to stress a better society, an answer to postmodern stupidity, which, by the way, we do actually need, I would agree with the right wing on that, you have to do it culturally. You can't simply say the government will handle things. Oh, the government will tell us what to do and order things. No, it won't. The same government that caused the mess is going to solve the mess. For what reason? because it's unprofitable and would take a long time and be torturous and stupid, government's never gonna do that, dude. The government's not your fucking daddy. The government's not your nanny. It doesn't want to help you. It wants a cut of your money, and that's it. At the end of the day, most people in government don't care. You look at the Dem field, tell me these people actually give a damn about your continued well-being of existence. They don't. You want to stop porn? Don't look at porn. It's pretty much as simple as that. You want to stop the drug epidemic? Stop railing against drug addicts and saying they should be in prison for 10 years. It's not going to work. They get out, the first thing they want is another dose of coke or heroin. Of course. What are you going to do? Oh, rehab for porn addicts. Okay, go ahead and set that up, but so long as you are insulting people for utilizing porn, they're not even going to seek that help that you're trying to set up for them. It's just not going to happen. You need a social movement. But it has to be voluntary. It can't, literally speaking, at least in the US, it can't constitutionally be construed as valid anyway. The First Amendment protects more than explicit forms of speech-based communication. It goes beyond that. The very fact that it includes the rights of the press shows that the intent of the founders was not, well, people, one person to another, shaking hands, looking each other in the eye and speaking, that's allowed, everything else is not protected. It has never been construed like that in the history of the United States. We have over 200 years of nonstop precedent that free speech is more expansive than that. Go ahead and talk about the societal ill of porn. You believe that it's bad. You believe that it exploits people. Okay, if you believe that, that's fine. It causes health issues, it causes ED or whatever. Great. Figure out an actual way to tackle those problems other than, well, we'll ban it. We'll do what we haven't been able to successfully do for any other perceived social ill. We'll throw a bunch of people in jail, wasted a century or a half a century and a whole shit ton of money prosecuting the unprosecutable, which will inevitably cause cartel growth and cause other actual forms of crime like assassinations and rape and human trafficking. You think those are problems in pornography right now? They would be 10 times worse if it were illicit. It is the law of the free market. The free market's oppressed as a black market. Who operates there? Some dude in a tweed coat who's respectable and totally cherishes his wife and daughter, or some seedy fucking fat ass that sits in the alley diddling himself? Unfortunately, it's the latter. If you can find victimization, it's always good to go after it and try to snuff it out. And it will inevitably exist. You can't create utopia, sadly. There will always be people who are abused. But you can make the situation better. The problem is, of course, the way to do that has never been and never will be government power. It's too centralized and too stupid. It's incapable of rallying people around any cultural ideal. Usually it's the cause of culture breaking down. I find it infinitely funny in closing that so many people would trust the U.S. government that they declare is responsible through subversion by foreign and domestic elements. They claim that it's been subverted and taken over by saboteurs in order to push postmodernism for some global agenda of slavery. And yet they want to give that government more power. This sounds exactly like people on the left saying, well, Trump is a tyrant. He's just like Hitler. Hey, Trump, pass gun control. Take more of our guns away. Oh yeah, Silicon Valley, billionaires are exploitative. Hey, Silicon Valley billionaires, censor us a little bit more. How masochistic jackboot licking do you have to be to actually be like that? So no offense to these people who want to ban porn, you gotta think it through a little bit more. That's about all. Peace out.